My name's Charles Fernyhough. I'm a professor of psychology at Durham University, and I'm director of a project called Hearing the Voice, a large interdisciplinary study of voice hearing funded by the Wellcome Trust. When you ask people about their inner experience, the kinds of things that go on in their heads from moment to moment, you find there's an awful lot of words. I mean, the kind of running conversation that we seem to have with ourselves, the monologue or dialogue that seems to be going on in our minds for a lot of the time as we're lying in the bath, walking to work, lying on the beach or whatever. So as a psychologist, I'm interested in what are all these words doing in the head? Where do they come from? And what is it like to have this stuff going on all the time? The theory that I found most interesting in this respect comes from a Russian psychologist called Lev Vygotsky. And Vygotsky's idea about all this was really quite simple. He argued that children are born into a social world where they're interacting with other people all the time. They start to have conversations, dialogues with other people, and over time those dialogues become internalized to become the inner speech, as psychologists call it, that conversation that's going on in our heads for much of the time. And that has certain implications for how inner speech functions for us as adults. One of the most important things is that inner speech will have a kind of social nature. It will have the quality of a conversation. So when you are talking to yourself, you really are talking to yourself. When I was starting out on this topic as a graduate student, there really wasn't much in the way of research on inner speech. And that's partly because it's a really difficult thing to study. You can't just listen in to someone's thoughts and hear what they're saying to themselves. But over time, over the last 20 years or so, there's been a real growth of research in this area because of new experimental techniques. We've got new neuroscientific methods that we can use, and now we have a bigger, a richer picture of how inner speech functions in the mind. Vygotsky's theory about where inner speech comes from has one really important implication, and that is that the conversation that we have with ourselves as adults has the properties of a dialogue because it comes from social exchanges, it comes from social conversations with other people. So it should have the same structure, it should have the same give and take of conversation. So you see this in young children talking to themselves. They'll ask themselves a question and then answer the same question for themselves. And I think we do it as well in our own inner speech, and certainly when we started to ask people what their inner speech is like, what this internal conversation is like. Many people will say it has the properties of a dialogue. It is like a conversation with the self. So how do we go about studying inner speech? Well, one thing you can do is simply ask people. For a long time, people weren't asking the question about what people's inner speech was like. We started to do this using a questionnaire we devised which asks about different qualities of inner speech, such as the extent to which it has a dialogic structure, for example. You can use more sophisticated methods such as descriptive experience sampling, where the participant wears a beeper attached to their clothing which goes off every so often. You hear a beep in your ear, and at that moment your cue is to start making quick notes on what was going on in your mind just before the beep went off. And then you come into the lab and you have a detailed interview about that moment of experience. You go back out into the world and do your beep capturing again. And we've run the first experiment which has integrated these really rich, nuanced, sophisticated descriptions of moments of experience with the power of neuroscientific techniques such as fMRI. So we're starting to find ways of capturing the nuance and the complexity of human experience and the contradictions of human experience, in fact, with these new scientific techniques, allowing us to put the mind and the brain together. When I was writing my book, The Voices Within, on this topic, I wanted to try and bring together this new research and get people thinking again about this really intimate, very familiar part of our experience that actually doesn't get much attention.